You think you know the people closest to you, but sometimes the most devastating betrayals come from those who should love you most. I'm Margaret, and at 65 years old, I discovered that my own daughter had been planning the ultimate theft, not just of my possessions, but of my dignity, my independence, and nearly my life itself. What started as a missing piece of jewelry became the key to uncovering a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that it still takes my breath away. But here's the thing about betrayal when it comes from family. It doesn't just break your heart, it shatters every assumption you've ever had about love, loyalty, and the people you've spent decades nurturing and protecting. The morning that changed everything began like any other Tuesday in my small apartment in Boston, Massachusetts. I was preparing my usual breakfast of oatmeal and fresh berries when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The antique jewelry box that had belonged to my grandmother, the one that sat prominently on my dresser for over 40 years, was sitting slightly askew, and when I opened it with trembling fingers, I discovered that my most precious possession was missing. My grandmother's diamond brooch, the one she had given me on my wedding day with tears in her eyes, telling me it would bring me luck and love throughout my marriage, was gone, and in its place was an empty velvet indentation that seemed to mock everything I held dear. My first instinct was panic, followed immediately by the kind of self-doubt that comes when you're a woman of a certain age living alone, wondering if perhaps you'd misplaced something so important. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never moved that brooch from its designated spot in the jewelry box, because every morning for the past 3 years since my husband Robert's death, I had opened that box just to look at it, remembering the weight of it pinned to my wedding dress, remembering grandmother's weathered hands as she fastened it just above my heart, remembering all the special occasions when I had worn it with pride, feeling connected to generations of strong women who had come before me. The realization hit me like a physical blow when I remembered that my daughter Sandra had been in my apartment just 2 days earlier, ostensibly to help me organize some paperwork for my insurance claims. But now I recalled how she had seemed distracted, how she had made several trips to my bedroom, claiming she was looking for documents, how she had insisted I sit in the living room while she handled everything, with an efficiency that I had attributed to her natural organizational skills, but now recognized as something far more sinister and calculating. Sandra had always been my pride and joy, my only child who had grown into a successful marketing executive with a beautiful home in the suburbs, a husband who worked in finance, and 2 teenage children who were the light of my life. But over the past year, something had changed in our relationship, something subtle but unmistakable that I had tried to ignore, hoping it was just the natural evolution of an adult child establishing independence. But looking back now, I could see the signs that I had been too trusting or perhaps too naive to recognize at the time. The phone calls had become less frequent, and when Sandra did visit, she seemed impatient, always checking her phone, always making comments about my living situation, suggesting that perhaps it was time I considered other options for my golden years, which I now understood were not suggestions born from love and concern, but calculated manipulations designed to make me doubt my own capabilities and independence, laying the groundwork for something I was only beginning to comprehend in its full, terrifying scope. I spent that entire Tuesday morning searching every inch of my apartment, moving furniture, checking behind drawers, looking in places where the brooch could never logically have been, because the alternative was too horrible to accept, that my own daughter, the child I had raised with infinite love and sacrifice, had stolen from me not just a piece of jewelry, but a tangible connection to my family history, to my grandmother's memory, to everything that anchored me to my past and gave meaning to my present circumstances. By noon, I could no longer deny what I knew in my heart to be true, so I picked up the phone with hands that shook, with a combination of grief, anger, and a kind of disbelief that accompanies the most profound betrayals, and I dialed Sandra's number, listening to it ring while I rehearsed in my mind how to approach this conversation, how to give my daughter the benefit of the doubt while still demanding answers about something that could not be explained away by coincidence or misunderstanding. Sandra answered on the fourth ring, her voice bright and cheerful, in a way that now seemed artificial and performative. "Hi, Mom, what's going on? Is everything okay with you today?" And I found myself momentarily speechless, because how do you ask your own child if they have stolen from you? How do you voice suspicions that feel like accusations of the most fundamental betrayal possible? How do you risk destroying a relationship that has been the cornerstone of your life for over 40 years? "Sandra, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the emotional earthquake happening inside my chest. "When you were here on Sunday helping with my paperwork, did you happen to notice my grandmother's diamond brooch in the jewelry box? Did you perhaps move it for any reason? Or do you know if it might have been displaced somehow during your visit to my apartment?" The silence that followed lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. And when Sandra finally responded, I could hear something in her voice that I had never heard before, a kind of calculating pause that made my stomach drop, with the recognition that my worst fears were about to be confirmed in ways I couldn't have imagined. "Mom, why are you asking me about jewelry? Are you having trouble keeping track of your things again? Because you know we've talked about this before, about how sometimes older people misplace items and then worry unnecessarily about things that are probably just sitting in a different drawer or box." The condescension in her voice was like a slap across my face. But more than that, it was the deliberate way she avoided answering my direct question, while simultaneously questioning my mental acuity, that told me everything I needed to know about what was happening. And I felt something inside me harden with a resolve I hadn't experienced since Robert's illness, when I had to become his advocate and protector against medical professionals who wanted to dismiss his concerns and minimize his pain. "Sandra, I am asking you a very simple question about whether you saw or moved a specific piece of jewelry when you were in my apartment 2 days ago," I said, allowing steel to enter my voice for the first time in our conversation. "This is not about my memory or my organizational skills. This is about a valuable family heirloom that is missing from the exact location where it has been kept for decades. And I need to know if you have any information about what might have happened to it, because the timing of its disappearance corresponds directly with your visit to my home." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a sigh that sounded more annoyed than concerned, which should have been my first clue about the depth of Sandra's deception and the extent to which she had already begun to view me not as her mother, but as an obstacle to be managed and ultimately removed from her path. "Mom, I think you need to consider that maybe you moved it yourself and forgot, or maybe you should. Check with your cleaning lady, because honestly, this kind of paranoia and suspicion isn't healthy, and I'm starting to worry about whether you should be living alone if you're going to start accusing family members of stealing from you." The word paranoia hit me like a physical blow, because it was such a deliberate choice, designed to make me question my own perceptions and doubt the validity of my concerns, and I realized with crystal clarity that this conversation was not about finding my grandmother's brooch, but about something much larger and more terrifying. A systematic attempt to undermine my credibility and independence in ways that would serve Sandra's purposes in some grand plan I was only beginning to understand. "I want you to come over here right now," I said, surprising myself with the authority in my voice. "We need to have a face-to-face conversation about this situation, and I want you to look me in the eye and tell me you don't know anything about my missing brooch, because your reaction to my questions has been anything but reassuring, and I think there are things we need to discuss that cannot be handled over the telephone." Sandra's response revealed the first crack in her composed facade. "Mom, I can't just drop everything and rush over there every time you have some crisis about misplaced items. I have responsibilities, I have work commitments, and frankly, this whole situation is becoming exhausting for me, constantly having to manage your Anxieties and complaints about things that are probably just the result of normal aging and the inability to keep track of personal belongings. The cruelty of that statement took my breath away, not just because of its dismissiveness, but because of the calculated way Sandra was using my age and my widow status as weapons against me, implying that my concerns were invalid simply because I was 65 and living alone. And I began to understand that this pattern of invalidation and condescension was not new, but had been building systematically over months, or perhaps even years, while I had been too grieving and too trusting to recognize it for what it was. That afternoon, I did something I had never done in my entire adult life. I hired a private investigator, a woman named Patricia Collins, who specialized in family disputes and elder abuse cases. And when I met her in her downtown Boston office, I felt both embarrassed and empowered by the step I was taking to protect myself and uncover the truth about what was happening in my own family. Because somewhere deep in my intuition, I knew that the missing brooch was just the beginning of something much more comprehensive and devastating. Patricia was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes but a businesslike manner, and she listened to my story without judgment or skepticism, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about Sandra's behavior patterns, her financial situation, her relationship with her husband, and any changes I had noticed in how she interacted with me over the past year or two. Mrs. Thompson, what you're describing sounds like a pattern we see unfortunately often in cases of adult children who are preparing to assume control over their parents' assets and decision-making capabilities, she said, her words confirming my worst fears while also validating the instincts I had been trying to suppress. The questioning of your memory, the suggestions about alternative living, arrangements, the sudden interest in your paperwork and financial documents. These are all classic indicators of someone who is laying the groundwork for what we call financial exploitation of an elderly person, which can range from simple theft to elaborate schemes designed to gain legal control over your entire estate and life decisions, Patricia continued. And I felt my world shift as I began to understand that Sandra's betrayal was not impulsive or opportunistic, but carefully planned and strategically executed over an extended period of time. Patricia's investigation over the next 2 weeks revealed details that made my missing brooch seem almost insignificant by comparison, because what she uncovered was a conspiracy involving not just Sandra, but her husband Michael. That included forged documents, unauthorized credit checks on my accounts, consultations with elder law attorneys about conservatorship proceedings, and most shocking of all, a detailed plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could assume control of my finances, sell my apartment, and place me in a care facility against my will. The evidence Patricia presented included photographs of Sandra and Michael meeting with lawyers, copies of documents they had prepared claiming I was suffering from dementia and could no longer manage my affairs, financial records showing they had already begun liquidating some of my investments without my knowledge or consent, and most devastatingly, audio. Recordings of conversations between Sandra and Michael, where they discussed their timeline for dealing with the mom situation, and calculated how much money they expected to inherit once they had gained full control over my assets and living situation. Listening to those recordings was like having my heart surgically removed while I was still conscious, because I heard my own daughter refer to me as a problem that needs to be solved and discuss the various care facilities they had researched, comparing costs and deciding which would be adequate for housing me while giving them maximum financial benefit, and the casual cruelty in their voices as they planned my future without any consideration for my wishes, my dignity, or my right to remain independent was almost unbearable to absorb. The brooch, as it turned out, had been sold to a jewelry buyer in downtown Boston for a fraction of its actual value, but Sandra and Michael had used it as a test case to see if I would notice its absence and how I would react, gathering information about my mental state and my willingness to confront them directly, which they then used to refine their strategy for the larger theft and manipulation they had been planning for months. Patricia's investigation also revealed that Sandra had been systematically isolating me from other family members and friends, telling them that I was becoming confused and difficult, that I was making up stories about people stealing from me, and that they should probably limit their contact with me to avoid upsetting my delicate mental state, which explained why my social circle had been shrinking and why people who had been important parts of my life suddenly seemed distant and uncomfortable around me. The legal documents Sandra and Michael had prepared were sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to make their conservatorship petition appear legitimate and necessary, complete with fabricated medical reports claiming I had been diagnosed with early-stage dementia and was no longer capable of making sound financial decisions. Documents that would have been devastating if presented in court without the contradictory evidence Patricia had gathered, proving their fraudulent nature and criminal intent. When Patricia showed me the recordings and documents, I experienced something I had never felt before in my 65 years of life. A rage so pure and consuming that it felt like a physical force burning through every cell in my body, not just anger at Sandra and Michael's betrayal, but fury at their assumption that I was weak enough to be manipulated, stupid enough to be deceived, and powerless enough to be victimized without fighting back with every resource at my disposal. The confrontation, when it finally came, took place in my apartment on a Thursday evening when Sandra arrived unexpectedly, claiming she wanted to check on me, but actually intending to plant additional evidence of my supposed mental deterioration by rearranging items in my home and then expressing concern about my housekeeping and organizational abilities, a tactic that Patricia had warned me to expect based on similar cases she had handled in the past. Sandra walked into my living room with the same artificial concern she had been displaying for months. But I was ready for her this time, armed with knowledge about her true intentions and evidence of her criminal activities. And when she began her usual routine of questioning whether I was taking care of myself properly and suggesting that perhaps I needed more help with daily activities, I interrupted her with a calm that surprised us both. "Sandra, I know about the conservatorship petition. I know about the forged medical reports. I know about the unauthorized access to my financial accounts. And I know about your plan to have me declared mentally incompetent so you can steal my assets and warehouse me in a care facility while you and Michael enjoy the fruits of your theft and fraud," I said, watching her face transform from fake concern to shock to something approaching fear as she realized her carefully constructed deception had been exposed. The next 30 minutes were among the most painful of my life, as Sandra initially tried to deny everything, then attempted to justify her actions as being in my best interest, and finally revealed the depth of her contempt for me by arguing that I was too old and too weak to manage my own life anyway, so she was simply helping me transition to a situation where I would be properly cared for while my assets were managed by people who understood financial planning and investment strategies better than I ever could. "You're 65 years old, Mom, and you're living alone in an apartment that's too big for you, obsessing over pieces of jewelry and imagining conspiracies where none exist," Sandra said. Her mask completely dropped now, revealing the calculating stranger she had become. "Michael and I have been trying to help you plan for your future, to make sure you're properly cared for as you get older, and instead of being grateful, you're treating us like criminals for trying to protect you from your own poor judgment and declining capabilities." The gaslighting was so blatant and cruel that I almost admired its audacity. This attempt to reframe theft as caregiving, fraud as protection, and my resistance to their scheme as evidence of the mental incapacity they were trying to establish legally. But I was no longer the confused and grieving widow they had counted on manipulating, because Patricia's investigation had given me both the evidence I needed to defend myself and the confidence to fight back against people who had underestimated my intelligence, my resources, and my determination to maintain my independence and dignity. "Sandra, you and Michael are going to prison," I said, with a certainty that seemed to physically stagger her. "Patricia Collins has been investigating your activities for 2 weeks, And we have recordings of your conversations about having me declared incompetent, copies of the forged documents you prepared, evidence of your unauthorized access to my accounts, and documentation of your systematic campaign to isolate me from family and friends by spreading lies about my mental health, all of which constitutes elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy charges that will result in significant prison sentences for both of you. Sandra's response revealed the final layer of her character as she abandoned any pretense of loving concern and launched into a vicious attack on my selfishness, my stubborn refusal to face reality about my age and limitations, and my cruel decision to destroy her family by pursuing legal action instead of simply cooperating with the reasonable arrangements she had tried to make for my care and the management of assets that would eventually belong to her children anyway. The police arrived 20 minutes later, not because I called them, but because Patricia had coordinated with law enforcement to arrest Sandra and Michael simultaneously based on the evidence we had gathered, and watching my daughter being read her rights and handcuffed in my living room was both the most satisfying and most heartbreaking moment of my entire life, because it represented both justice for her betrayal and the final destruction of the relationship that had once been the most important bond in my world. The legal proceedings that followed were swift and decisive because the evidence of Sandra and Michael's crimes was overwhelming and undeniable, and their attempts to claim they were acting in my best interest were demolished by the recordings of their private conversations where they discussed their financial motivations and their callous plans for my future with no regard for my wishes or well-being. Sandra received a sentence of 3 years in prison for elder abuse, fraud, and conspiracy, while Michael received 2 years for his role in the scheme, and both were ordered to pay full restitution for the money they had stolen from my accounts, though the financial compensation could never repair the emotional damage they had inflicted or restore the trust they had shattered through their betrayal. The aftermath of Sandra's arrest brought unexpected revelations about the extent of their deception, as other family members came forward to tell me about the lies Sandra had spread about my mental condition, the warnings she had given them about my paranoid behavior, and the systematic way she had worked to isolate me from my support network while positioning herself as my primary caregiver and advocate, a role that would have given her enormous power once she succeeded in having me declared incompetent. My grandmother's brooch was eventually recovered from the jewelry buyer who had purchased it from Sandra, and when I held it in my hands again, I felt not just relief at its return, but a profound connection to the strength and resilience of the women who had worn it before me, women who had faced their own challenges and betrayals with courage and determination, leaving me a legacy not just of material objects, but of the inner resources needed to survive and overcome even the most devastating attacks on my dignity and independence. The months that followed were a process of rebuilding not just my sense of security, but my entire understanding of family, trust, and the ways that love can be weaponized by people who prioritize their own interests over the well-being of those they claim to care about. And while the pain of Sandra's betrayal will never completely disappear, it has been balanced by the discovery of my own strength and the realization that I am far more capable and resilient than I had ever imagined myself to be. Today, at 66, I live independently in a new apartment with enhanced security measures, surrounded by friends who value my intelligence and companionship rather than viewing me as a burden or an obstacle. And I have become an advocate for other elderly people who are vulnerable to the kind of exploitation I experienced, working with organizations that help seniors recognize and resist attempts by family members to manipulate them into surrendering their autonomy and assets. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that trust, once broken by fundamental betrayal, cannot be rebuilt simply through apologies or promises, but that the absence of trust does not necessarily mean the absence of strength. Because sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to be victimized by people who mistake your kindness for weakness and your age for vulnerability. setting boundaries that protect your dignity even when they come at the cost of relationships you once considered irreplaceable. For anyone watching this who recognizes similar patterns in their own family relationships, please understand that questioning someone's mental capacity, isolating them from friends and support systems, and pressuring them to surrender control over their finances and living situations are classic tactics of elder abuse, and that seeking help from professionals like attorneys, private investigators, or social services is not an overreaction, but a necessary step in protecting yourself from people who would exploit your trust and vulnerability for their own financial gain, regardless of their relationship to you or their claims of loving concern. The diamond brooch now sits in a safety deposit box at my bank, but its real value was never in its monetary worth, but in what it taught me about the importance of protecting the things that matter most, whether they are material possessions that connect us to our history, or the more intangible assets of dignity, independence, and self-respect that define who we are and how we choose to live our lives, even when those choices disappoint or anger people, who believe they have the right to make decisions for us based on their own interests rather than our expressed wishes and demonstrated capabilities. If you found this story helpful or recognized elements of your own experience in what I've shared, please like this video and subscribe to my channel, because speaking truth about family betrayal and elder abuse is one way we can protect each other from predators who count on our silence and shame to enable their crimes. And remember that age brings wisdom and experience that make us valuable, not vulnerable, and that anyone who tries to convince you otherwise may have motivations that serve their interests rather than your well-being and long-term happiness.